If you want to open your Bibles or your phones, whatever it is, we're going to start in 2 Chronicles. We're going to be a little bit in Kings. We're going to be a little bit all over the place. We finished our series in 1 Chronicles on leadership secrets in the life of David, and we're going to be moving on either next week or the following week to the book of Nehemiah. Moving on to the book of Nehemiah. And if you're a big picture person like me, like I'm an intuitive on the Myers-Briggs, right? Everything for me is 70,000 feet. If you're a big picture person, it's helpful to kind of know what fills in the gap, right? It's helpful to know what fills in the gap between David and Solomon and Nehemiah. Because David and Solomon, we got the golden age of Israel, and then all of a sudden in Nehemiah, we have people returning from captivity. And if that's all you know, it's kind of like, huh? How did we go from the golden age to captivity? So I figure we're going back to school. Jordan's going back to school. The kids are going back to school. The teachers are going back to school. We might as well start off with somewhat of a math equation. It's kind of like, I don't know about you, word problems were not my favorite in school. Who liked word problems? Okay, there you go. I'm in the majority, right? But here it is. It's like algebra, right? Or anyway, I don't even know my math terms. It's been too long. Hatred of sin is directly proportional to love for God's glory. It's a math equation you can take into the school year with you. And like algebra, you can flip it back and forth across the equal sign, right? Hatred of sin is directly proportional to a love for God's glory. In our lives, these two things always affect each other. How much in a given moment we are loving the glory of God will directly impact how much in that same moment we hate sin. And in those moments, and I've been so convicted even in my own life about this week, in those moments where we love sin, and we might as well admit it, there are moments for all of us where we love sin. In those moments where we love sin, it's because we have ceased to love the glory of God. You can't love the darkness and the light at the same time. You can't do it. We recently moved from the rental to a house that we bought by the grace of God, and in the old rental, we had put up a whole bunch of new lights because we like bright light in our houses. One with a big old chandelier and everything I found on Craigslist. Great blessing. But so as we were getting ready to move, we had to take them all down, and we had to put up the dingy lights that the landlords had in the house. And it's like the closer we got to the move, the more we put the house back, the darker and the dimmer the house felt. And I just I love light. When I'm at my best, when I'm in the Spirit, I love light. The Bible says men love darkness because their deeds are evil. Hatred of sin is directly proportional to love for the glory of God. So we just left off David. Chad preached last week, great message. I listened to it online because we were out of town last weekend. David being vested in the vision, right? He gets it all set up for the temple. He contributes a ton of gold from his own stores and his own wealth for the temple. God says, you're not going to build the temple. You're a man of blood. Your son can build the temple. And so Solomon goes on to build the temple. Solomon builds the temple. It's fantastic. Probably for the time, the most fantastic building that existed in the world. Right? People came from all over the known world to see the temple. After he builds the temple, he blesses the people. He prays this beautiful, long prayer over the people. If you want to go read 1 Chronicles 1 through 7, it's a great set of chapters that will connect you from David through to Solomon. And as we come to 2 Chronicles chapter 7, we see it says in verses 1 through 3, as soon as Solomon finished his prayer, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. And the priests could not enter the house of the Lord, because the glory of the Lord filled the Lord's house. When all the people of Israel saw the fire come down and the glory of the Lord on the temple, they bowed down with their faces to the ground on the pavement and worshiped and gave thanks to the Lord, saying, for he is good, his steadfast love endures forever. How awesome is that, right? You got to think, kingdom passes to Solomon. He builds a temple. And here we see an Exodus-style display of the glory of God. Remember the Exodus? God leads them out of Egypt by a mighty hand. He takes them through the wilderness, a cloud of fire at night, or a pillar of fire at night, a cloud throughout the day, and he's leading his people. Moses is going up and down from the mountain. God is crashing up there, talking to him in thunder and lightning. The people are afraid to approach the mountain. They're experiencing the glory of God, and it's a wonderful time. But back then, even though God leads them out of Egypt by a mighty hand, he frees them from slavery by a mighty hand. They see his mighty display of power. What happens shortly thereafter? They complain and whine. They take their eyes off everything he's done for them, and he says, all right, this generation's done. You're going to die in the wilderness. And you would think that a people who had such a catastrophically glorious history would have learned their lesson. But history has a way of cycling around. You've heard the maxim, right? Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, right? I'm not a very good student of history. I like some of it here and there, but it wasn't my favorite. I got a C in it in college, right? But it holds true. Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. The Israelite people, which is the people of God in the Old Testament, our forebears, people of God, they display this over and again, and we see the same thing with Solomon, because not only here with Solomon at the dedication of the temple do we see this amazing display of God's glory, we see an amazing display of God's glory in the vast wealth that he gives to Israel. If we go to 1 Kings chapter 10, Kings and Chronicles kind of run parallel. The account in 1 Kings is a little more descriptive. We go to 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 21, and it says, all King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold. All the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. None were silver. Silver was not considered as anything in the days of Solomon. I mean, think about that. I don't know about you, but like the most gold that's in my life is on my finger, right? That's, I mean, for most of us, that's where our gold is, right? His cup. His goblets were solid gold, all of them. They were eating on gold. In the house in the forest, it was gold. Silver was not considered as anything. It was common. You'd leave it on the ground like we would a penny in the Walmart parking lot, right? You know, that's how it is, right? Okay, they had so much wealth. And then we think we're about to get to Nehemiah in a week or two, and they're coming out of captivity. What happened? If we just go one chapter over in 1 Kings, we get to 1 Kings chapter 11. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow after the Lord as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. So he did for all his foreign wives who made offerings and sacrifices to their gods. Even in Solomon. What happens? Our hatred of sin is directly proportional to our love for the glory of God. And when we turn our eyes away from the glory of God, we look to other gods as glorious. When we lose sight of God's glory, other gods, small g, become glorious. So God, big G, right? Yahweh, Jehovah, Creator God, big G, the only true God, the Creator of all. But there are lesser gods, idols, demons, right, that want to be worshipped. Satan wants to be worshipped instead of God. when we lose sight of God's glory, other gods become glorious. And here's the truth. Other gods always, without fail, enslave and kill. What God wants for you is freedom. What God wanted for his people was freedom. He brings them out of Egypt into freedom, and they complain about it. He brings them into Israel. He gives them the temple. He displays his glory in the temple, and he gives them freedom. And it's this beautiful picture. When we think about Solomon and the golden age of Israel, it points us forward to the kingdom that is to come, right? The kingdom where we will have real freedom ultimately, because the flesh will be removed from us completely. We will no longer have a propensity to sin. And not having that propensity to sin, knowing how ugly sin was in our past life, we will never sin again with Jesus in eternity, where Revelation, the streets will be paved with gold, right? Jesus' kingdom will always be way more than one step better. If in Solomon's day silver was common as anything, in Jesus' kingdom gold will be common as anything. And that calls us to look at this life and be disenchanted with the world, with the powers of darkness. Sin, the gods of sin and the gods of the world would have us look at it and them and think that they're glorious. And they use all the classic temptations of appetite, approval, and ambition, right? They want us to want to be celebrities, to be competitors, and to be consumers. If you've been around at Crossroads for a while, you've heard that paradigm a whole bunch, right? And we see it all throughout history. And what I want for you is to not repeat the cycle. Paul, having come full circle and realizing how ugly sin is, says, how can we who have died to sin live any longer in it? Solomon sets up these idols throughout the land. His wives bring them in, just like David's first wife brought idols into his life. And Solomon ultimately sets up other gods for the people to worship. As goes the king, so go the people. He sets them up to worship, and the people go to worship them. And the sin that comes with the enslavement of worshiping other gods trickles down throughout the generations, just like it has all throughout the cycles of history that we see in the world. Ecclesiastes says the wind goes on its circle, the waters go on its circle, everything is circular, right? From the very beginning, Adam and Eve sin in the garden. By chapter 6, God repents that he has made man on the earth. He redeems them in the flood. Sin starts all over again. Abraham, sin starts all over again. Redeems them from Egypt. Sin starts all over again. They go to worship idols. Even in the wilderness, right? So God pulls them out of Egypt by a mighty hand. He spread the waters of the Red Sea so they could walk across on dry land, and then crashed it back down on the Egyptians. Does it get more amazing, right? They get to the mount. Moses is up on the mount for a few days, and they forget. And they say to Aaron, build us a god. Make a god for us. They take all their gold. They had just pillaged the Egyptians. And they take all that gold, and he makes a golden calf for them. And immediately they begin to worship that golden calf, just like the Egyptians worshiped their gods. It says, they bowed down and they rose up to play. And the thing is, sin works its way. Those gods work their way back into our lives in the same way. It's in the same way. It looks different for us because we live in a despiritualized, intellectual Western culture, right? We laugh at the Buddha idols at the Chinese restaurants, right? The big fat belly guys. But that's the closest you and I really come with interacting with a true idol. Yeah? When was the last time you bowed down to a golden calf? Hopefully nobody raised their hand. Yeah? Okay. But the deal is those gods haven't gone away. It just manifests differently. And those gods whose worship was predominantly sexual, whose worship included child sacrifice, they are still being worshiped today, and they wriggle their way back into our families. So Jesus says, even if you look at a woman with lust in your heart, it's the same as if you committed adultery. See, he doesn't say this to lay a heavy burden on us. He says it so that we recognize lust for as ugly as it is. Because we have the temptation with our flesh, our propensity to sin, to say it's not actually that bad. But he wants us to see it for every bit as ugly as it is. He says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light, because there is actually joy apart from lust. And there is sorrow and misery and deprivation and murder at the end of lust. There's death at the end of it. And the thing is, the gods of sex have been present all throughout history, involving all sorts of carnality. We talked about the golden calf, right? Where it says they rose up to play, hashtag euphemism. The definition will be up on the screen, right? It's affected euphemism, right? A mild or indirect word for the expression substituted for one considered too harsh or blunt when referring to something unpleasant or embarrassing, right? You get it, yeah? So immediately, they come out of Egypt, and all of a sudden, they're back in it, right? It's ugly. And today, it's the same thing. And it sneaks into our homes in ways that we don't want to identify, but it's the truth. It's not hard to figure backwards logically from the sex trade where women are sold to nudes on the movie screen. It figures. It's just sometimes our flesh keeps us from actually recognizing that fact. And like little drops of poison, we let it back into our homes. And we end up worshiping the same gods. Moloch. They worship Moloch. That's one of the gods that Solomon set up an altar to, and they would sacrifice children to him. They would sacrifice children. How do we sacrifice children today? Abortion. But not just abortion. It's not always the worst case. We sacrifice our children by ignoring them, by not loving them, by not showing them the kingdom of God, by not giving them time, right? We still do it. They're still there. See, Satan is an old dog with old tricks. They're really good tricks, but it's not like they're new tricks. It's the same tricks. So, and he exegetes culture. He learns and works in the culture so much better than we do sometimes, right? And he has primitive gods for primitive cultures, and he has technological gods for technological cultures. And the same sin sets come in and influence those same people, sometimes in primitive ways and sometimes in technological ways. So back then they burnt children. Today we ignore children. Back then they sacrificed children so that Baal would make it rain on the earth, because they needed rain on the earth to have crops to grow. Today, we sacrifice children so that we can get enough money for whatever level of living we deem necessary. And it's still those gods getting into our life. And I'm not trying to, I don't want to be preaching that pulpit pounding, you're all sinners message. I want you to see, as God has been bringing me in my life to see that it is ugly and painful and leading to death. It enslaves. All lesser gods enslave. And it's poison. You know, a little drop of poison a day isn't going to kill you right away, but it will ultimately, right? It will kill you ultimately. Sin is poison, and its gods are the purveyor of it. All the way back to Adam and Eve. Satan gets Eve. He deceives Eve. Adam sins. Satan gets Adam and Eve to take their eyes off of God's glory and set their eyes on something else. And when we're not looking at God's glory, other gods, other things become glorious. Adam and Eve are created free creatures to live in that free environment. They're free within the confines of their nature, just like God in whose image they were created, right? And they're given the freedom by the choice represented by the tree. They look at it Eve says it's good to eat, appetite, right? Satan says you get to be like God, ambition. Adam chooses Eve over God, approval. We see all three things happening right there. And just like our forefather and foremother, when we choose sin, it's because we're choosing sinful pleasure over God pleasure. We choose sinful pleasure over God pleasure. And we only choose sinful pleasure over God pleasure when God doesn't seem pleasant to us. And God only doesn't seem pleasant to us when we take our eyes off of him. You see, the gospel is freedom. It's freedom from slavery. When we're talking about physical slavery, no one would ever go back to physical slavery, right? When you're freed from it, no one would ever willfully return to the whip, to the shackle, to the fields. Because we hate it. We want freedom. But we get the picture so confused sometimes when we're deceived by the devil, when we're deceived by our flesh, and we say, that little sin looks really good. It doesn't look good in the light. It doesn't look good in the light. We choose sin pleasure over God pleasure when God doesn't feel pleasant. And God ceases to feel pleasant for us when we cease to be near him. And when we lose sight of his glory, other gods seem glorious. So here we're coming into a new season. We're coming into the fall. It's a growth season, right? Our kids are going back to school. We're leaving the summer, the relaxing. Hopefully, I hope you had a great summer. We're getting ready to move into the fall. Most of us are going to get busier as we move into the fall. And with that busyness comes all sorts of other temptations. And I would ask you, what regular rhythms are in place or need to be put back in place? Look, I'm human. I get it. We all fall out of our rhythms, right? What regular, simple, repeatable rhythms need to be put back in place in your life to make sure that God's glory is close at hand as you march forward into the fall? To ensure that God is glorious to you. Are you connecting up with God each morning? Tomorrow's a new day, right? Are you walking with him in the evening? Tonight's a new night. Are you attending to his revealed word? It's a big picture here that we get to hold in our hands. Are you listening for his voice? See, it's not good enough to want heaven then and this life now. Salvation, the gospel, the cross, it was never meant to be an e-ticket to glory on coach, where we get to hang out in our misery and enjoy misery. It's a first-class walk through a holy life of sanctification where we resemble Jesus more and more every day. So coming out of the summer, coming into the fall, ask yourself, where have I been kneeling at the feet of other gods? We all have. What rhythms have I been missing out on that will keep God glorious and pleasant to me? Taste and see that the Lord is good.